It's really important for healthy development that children feel comfortable that they can rely on someone and depend on someone to meet their emotional needs. They're engaging in a lot of conflict and a lot of what we call parent-child coercion happening. And essentially the idea is to help coach the parent on developing non-coercive, more consistent discipline in the context of a positive parent-child relationship.
Well, what you're saying is taking me back to foundations, in which you taught me and Dave about the shared decision-making model in terms of evidence-based, but also, values and, doing what's collaborative for the client as well.
The attachment coin, that there's two sides to the coin, that there's the attachment need of connection on one side, and then on the other side, there's the need for independence.
Welcome to the Mental Wellbeing Show, where we take a deep dive into the wonderful worlds of psychology and mental wellbeing.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me on today's episode of the Mental Wellbeing Show. Today we have a very special guest joining us, Dr. Dave Pasalich, to discuss all things attachment-based parenting. Dave's a rather special guest because I had the absolute privilege of being taught and lectured by Dave last year. And I could speak all day about how much he's kind of mentored and impacted my own professional development and his genuine nature and just great lecturing abilities in which I learned so much from him. But more relevant for today's conversation is that Dave is a clinical child psychologist, a lecturer and researcher at the Australian National University. And in the past, he's held positions, lectured, taught and researched in Sydney, Canberra, and in America and Canada throughout North America. So in today's conversation, we discuss all things attachment-based parenting, how to develop and maintain a secure attachment with your child and later on with your teenager, the debate and controversies around Timeout as a parenting practice, and much, much more. Now, today's conversation is on a topic similar to a discussion I had with Dr. Jesse Stern, which is attachment styles. However, in that discussion with Dr. Stern, we come at it more from a romantic relationship and adult attachment style perspective, whereas in today, the focus is largely on attachment-based parenting and attachment styles between the child and parent. So if you'd like to learn more about attachment styles and how they play out in your relationships as an adult, particularly in your romantic relationships, then check out the link in the show notes for that episode with Dr. Jesse Stern. But for all things attachment-based parenting, let's dive into this discussion with Dr. Dave Pasalich. Dr. Dave Pasalich, thank you for joining me on the Mental Wellbeing Show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Indy.
Yeah, it's one that I'm really looking forward to, given the topic, and is one that I'm certainly interested in, and I think a lot of people will get a lot of value from. But also, I've shared this with you a couple of times, but you've had a pretty big impact on my life just through being in your class, and I wanted to kind of share that and share that I found your lecturing to be a very unique kind of style where I feel uniquely comfortable, challenging material. So yeah, you've had a very big impact in my life in the short time that I've had the privilege of knowing you.
Oh, thank you so much. That's super encouraging, and I think I learned a lot from you as well, Indy. I think that your engagement and your questions were really it made me reflect a lot on the content of our discussions as well. So thank you.
Thanks. That's always good to hear. I think in terms of starting with attachment security today, the first place I think it makes sense to start is by unpacking what attachment security is. So can you tell us a little bit about what attachment styles and attachment security are?
Yeah, so essentially when we think about, attachment, it's that emotional bond between a child and their caregiver, okay? So that's the attachment relationship. And when we talk about attachment from the child's perspective specifically, it's really the child having felt security or confidence that they can go to their caregiver when they're distressed, when they're sad, when they're upset, and that caregiver is going to be available. That caregiver at a young age will be physically available. Across all ages, that caregiver will be emotionally, psychologically available. And essentially that caregiver is going to operate as a safe haven. So in other words, that caregiver will be someone who will be there for that child to help them regulate their distress or their stress, and to provide that sort of emotional top up, if you'd like. So that's sort of one half of secure attachment. And then the other half of secure attachment is really that the child is able to effectively use that caregiver as a secure base. So in other words, the child can feel confident that they can go out and to explore the world, to explore their environment, and their caregiver is going to be there for them when they get back. And so when we do talk about secure attachments, we're really referring to two main concepts. The concept of a safe haven, so that caregiver being there to comfort the child, and the other concept of a secure base, so that caregiver being like a safe harbour, if you like, for the child to explore. Because it's really important for healthy development that children feel comfortable, that they can rely on someone and depend on someone to meet their emotional needs. But it's also part of healthy development in children and across the lifespan, really, is that we're able to go out and to explore the world around us.
So you touched on that there in terms of the kind of later development of a child. What are some of the outcomes that a secure bond and having that safe haven predicts in childhood and later in life, if you can?
I think, if a child is able to develop a secure attachment, we know from a lot of research now that is a really positive thing for the child's development. So developmentally, we know that a secure attachment is associated with things like being able to have positive relationships with other adults, being able to have positive relationships with peers. It can help the child regulate their emotions, particularly the sort of the difficult emotions. We know that it can help the child regulate their behaviour. We also know that it's linked to the development of empathy and conscience. And so it has a lot of important effects on different domains of child development and mental health and well-being. It's not to say that, attachment is everything. It's not just attachment that predicts, good things later on. It's really an interaction of all different risk and protective factors. But, when we are talking about, say, mental health in infants, attachment is really foundational. And so, I think it really is the cornerstone of healthy development in the very early years. But as John Bowlby said, that the father of attachment theory, that, attachment is from cradle through to grave. In other words, we have it when we're born and we have it on our deathbed. And so we all have attachment needs across development, across the lifespan. It's just that we express these needs differently depending on our age and our circumstances as well.
So I think you touched on an important point there about attachment. I think in your words, isn't everything. So is a secure attachment kind of categorically better? Is it always better and always something that from a parent's point of view, you should aim for with your child?
When you say, is it always better? I guess, is the comparison, is it better than an insecure attachment? And naturally, yes. And just briefly in terms of what an insecure attachment is, it's essentially where a child has maybe developed other strategies to meet their needs. So maybe in the context of a caregiver who is sort of inconsistent toward the child in terms of meeting their needs. So sometimes they're there for the child, other times they're not. Perhaps the child is able to adapt to that situation, and they might develop, an anxious, resistant sort of attachment style, where this is where we see kids who are very clingy and they're sort of ambivalent. They kind of want to go to their caregiver, but they don't, and they've really learned to escalate their emotionality and their needs in order to have the best chance of that caregiver meeting their needs. So they really need to up those needs to make them more salient, to really grab the attention of that caregiver. So that can be one example of an insecure attachment style. Another example of an insecure attachment style is avoidant attachment. So essentially, these are kids who, on the surface, look like they're just sort of, they don't sort of need anyone's support or guidance. But if you were to look beneath the surface, you'll see that actually for a lot of these kids, the heart rate is very high. And they're struggling on the inside, but they've learnt that, my caregiver is probably not going to respond to my needs. And so it's better that if I don't express these needs, that's going to be more comfortable for us both. And so these kids learn to sort of, to suppress or to avoid any expression of attachment needs And so, essentially the caregiver can respond in kind, and over time that child develops a stronger sort of avoidant attachment. And then the most concerning end of insecure attachments are children who develop disorganized attachments. And essentially these are kids who really have no coherent or organized strategy for utilizing that caregiver when they feel distressed or stressed or, upset or scared or whatever it might be. And so these are kids who might show very bizarre, contradictory kind of behaviors when their attachment system is activated. And these are kids who have been exposed to maybe quite sort of frightening or frightened parenting. And so often you'll see in these families that there might be some really kind of serious issues happening, like family domestic violence, or the parent might have a mental health problem or struggling with substance use. And so to come back all the way to your question, Indy, you said, is a secure attachment better than an insecure attachment? I mean, it is, because, we know from the research. But I think just intuitively as parents, we want our child to feel safe and secure that, we're going to be here to meet their needs when they have them. And they can use us as a secure base from which they can explore.
So is it too much of a stretch then to say that the kind of attachment relationship and attachment bond that a parent has with their child is essentially like the blueprint for relationships later on, both kind of platonic and romantic, and that the beliefs you have formed in that attachment bond between parent and child kind of almost like transferred onto your other relationships later in life?
Oh man, I feel like we're back in class, Indy, with these terrific questions. I think that's a really important question to ask, and that has been the focus of some sort of debate in the literature. But essentially, what I can say based on my understanding is that, the original ideas in attachment theory were that, a child would over time internalize these interactions that they're having with their caregiver, and they'd form this sort of internal working model, or this sort of, if you like, this relationship map of expectations in regards to significant others. So say if a child develops an insecure attachment, they might learn that I can't trust and depend on others. So I'm not going to be vulnerable. I'm not going to show my emotions because others aren't trustworthy, and that I might not be lovable. And so say if all of our experiences throughout development were consistent with that, and let's say if I had an impact on others in the sense that I didn't show my needs and others didn't respond to that, that would just keep on confirming my beliefs that others aren't trustworthy. So if that were to be consistent across development, perhaps it could be a blueprint for problematic relationships in adulthood. However, it's really important to recognize that, attachment styles and attachment quality are both stable and malleable. We do see a lot of change throughout development, even in the midst of, across spans of 6 months to a year, the children can change attachment styles, at least according to, ways of assessing attachment. And so there is another concept in the literature about earned security. So let's say a child grows up in a difficult family environment where the caregiver is not psychologically available for that child. They might develop an insecure attachment, but maybe later on they go to school and they meet a natural adult mentor, or they have really healthy, strong, positive relationships with peers or romantic partners. That can actually challenge their sort of relationship map, which has been internalized, and they actually might sort of earn security, if you'd like. So although it is somewhat of a blueprint, the research suggests that there sort of is a small relationship between an individual's early caregiving environment in childhood, so the quality of that caregiving environment, and their later sort of adult relational outcomes. Okay, so there is a relationship, but it's a small one, because so much happens all the way from early childhood through to adulthood. There's so many different life experiences that can happen for both better and worse. So, another example is a child who develops an early secure attachment, but actually becomes insecure as an adult. But I do want to make another point, if you don't mind, Indy. That it's also important to recognize that when it comes to attachment relationships, that a child can have a secure attachment with one caregiver or one adult, and an insecure attachment with another caregiver and another adult. And it's really important to recognize that when it comes to insecure attachment styles, specifically the anxious resistant one that I just spoke about, and the avoidant one, is that they're actually adaptive strategies. The child has actually been quite smart in working out that, for instance, when it comes to a caregiver who is sort of inconsistently available, that, if I escalate my needs, I've got a better chance of that caregiver responding to me. And so developing that anxious resistance sort of style is actually adaptive in the context of that relationship. But when it becomes maladaptive or problematic, that's when the child goes into another relationship. And they might have, say, a teacher who's consistently responsive, and that child doesn't need to escalate their needs for that teacher to respond to them, because that teacher is going to be there for them. So, it's important to understand that, in child development, that something like an insecure attachment can be adaptive in one relationship or situation, but maladaptive in another.
Yeah, okay, that's such an important point, and that makes intuitive sense in the context of the parent-child relationship. And I think coming back to your point about insecurity, at least anecdotally, that feels like very very similar to my own experience, in the sense that I identify with growing up with a more of the kind of anxious, insecure attachment style. But anecdotally, I do feel like my security, because as I understand it, attachment styles exist on a dimension, but my security actually has kind of increased over time through a different relationship, if you like, with partners, but also my own parents, and how that's kind of changed the way that I view future relationships. So it sounds very empowering to know that it's fluid and it can be changed over time.
Yeah, and I think it's really encouraging to hear you reflect on this, Cindy, because it really taps into when we become parents as well, that we want to have insight into our own childhood experiences. We want to understand that, hey, if I was insecure growing up, what was associated with that, and how have I changed, and how might I do things differently when it comes to parenting my own child. And so I think being reflective about our own attachment histories is really healthy, and in fact, it actually can promote more sensitive caregiving as well. So I think that's really encouraging, and it's only natural that, when we do talk about attachment theory, and I definitely do it myself a lot, it's only natural that we reflect on our own experiences. And when I do these lectures in the context of my teaching, I do encourage students to reflect within a safe space, because again, I think that's a really healthy way to grow as a person, but also as a professional, particularly if you're in the field of helping others.
And in the way of kind of attachment-based parenting, I'd like to dive into some of the kind of interventions that there are out there. I know, for example, Connect is one that you've done a lot of work on, but are there specific interventions that parents or parents-to-be can kind of look into further if they wanted to improve their own attachment security, or improve their future attachment security with their future child?
Yeah, there are some evidence-based interventions out there that are based on attachment theory. So probably a good example would be, and also it's relevant in a local context here, is the Circle of Security program that was developed by researchers and clinicians in the US a couple of decades ago at least now. And so that has some evidence, and that's growing in its evidence. You mentioned the Connect program is something that I've been working on as well. And so I should mention that there are some programs that are suitable for caregivers of younger children, so infants, toddlers, preschoolers. And then there are some interventions for parents that are suitable for those who are parenting older children and adolescents. And there are different programs for different developmental periods. The reason why is because, just to go back on what I said earlier, is that although we all have attachment needs, we express them differently across different developmental stages. So, what a caregiver might do with a 1-year-old would be quite different to what a caregiver might do with a 14-year-old. So there's definitely some evidence-based interventions out there that are available.
And in terms of those interventions, what are some of the kind of foundational principles of attachment-based parenting?
Yeah, so in line with attachment theory, that these interventions, what they all have in common, in the very least, is that they're going to be targeting sensitive caregiving. So, and sensitive caregiving is really about the caregiver being responsive to the child's cues of distress, okay, and doing this in a sensitive and a well-timed manner. and also really about accepting the child and their emotions and attachment needs. And also, a lot of these interventions will be targeting what we call reflective functioning, or if you like, kind of reflective parenting. And so that's really about kind of going beneath the behavior and being curious about, the child's mental states that are related to their behavior. So in other words, why is my child doing what they're doing? And so there's a researcher called Peter Fonagy who talks about reflective parenting in terms of it's really about seeing ourselves as a parent from the outside, and viewing the child from the inside. And so it's really the capacity to notice and to reflect on our own and our child's mental states. And so when I say mental states, I'm really referring to our desires, our thoughts, our feelings, cognitions and all that type of stuff. And so it's really important as a caregiver to be psychologically minded toward the self and toward the child, because that's really going to enhance our sensitive responsiveness to that child as well. So it's about being, yes, warm and accepting toward the child, but also, being curious about, what is it about my child's behavior that might be telling me something about their deeper attachment needs. So to give you an example, right now I'm parenting my daughter who's 10 months old. And, she'll show me a lot of different attachment behaviors. At the moment, she's just developed separation anxiety, which is a really healthy milestone. And so when she started to develop separation anxiety, I was like, yes, great, because it shows that she's developing along a healthy trajectory. It can be a bit more stressful for a parent, but it is a beautiful natural thing, and it shows that she's really starting to become more selective with her attachment figures. But I'll come home from work and she'll crawl up to me and she'll sit at my feet and she'll just put her hands up, or she'll clap and she'll put her hands up to me. And I understand that as her saying, Daddy, you are here, pick me up. Can you enjoy me and delight in me? So, of course, I'll swoop her up, I'll pick her up, and we'll have some cuddle time. And so, that's me trying to be sensitive towards her needs. That's me trying to reflect on, what is it about her behavior that she's expressing to me in terms of her need, in this case, the need for connection and the need for safe haven. So, so really the attachment-based interventions will target, caregiver sensitivity, caregiver reflective thinking, and then the sort of interventions can kind of vary in terms of what else they might target, but they're often some of the main components that you'll see across the different interventions.
So that's the notion that like every behavior has a function, right? And trying to kind of tap into what that function of the behavior of your child is.
Yeah, and it's what we actually have a principle in the Connect Parent program, which is an attachment-based intervention for older children and adolescents, and really the first principle that we share with parents and caregivers is that all behaviour has meaning, and like you said, Indy, that behaviour has function, and so the same behaviour can have different meanings within that child and across different children. And I think that we're all naturally, as humans, we're always engaging in sort of reflective thinking or reflective functioning. We're constantly trying to work out what is it that person is thinking, or why did they just say that to me? What was their desire or their motivation? And as I tell my friends and other people and stuff, essentially, we're all psychologists. We're all trying to work out where everyone else is coming from. It just can be a bit more difficult for some people than others if we've had really kind of difficult, rocky early experiences in relationships, and then we developed expectations that might be sort of negative, and then it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy where we act in a certain way to someone, they'll respond in kind, and that will then confirm our sort of negative expectation in relationships.
I've really tried to take on board this whole notion of attachment security. When I first came across attachment styles in, what was it, probably first year psychology, right? And, the more I look into it, the more there does seem to be a really strong evidence base behind these interventions. But in all of 5 minutes that I've been working as a clinician at a child psych clinic, and, you work obviously a lot with parents, the one thing that I find is that parents, when I kind of educate them on, attachment security, they walk away thinking, yeah, this makes sense. Yes, I can do this. And there's a real sense of belief that there's going to be change moving forward with a relationship with their child. But often I find that they report back that it's difficult to kind of parent from an attachment based perspective when their child is throwing a tantrum at the shops, or when their child is really dysregulated. It's a lot easier to try and, just kind of in a short term myopic sense, kind of just stop the behavior, perhaps at the cost of attachment. So, and I'm not a parent myself, but I can understand where they're coming from. So how can parents go about navigating that and those kind of situations?
Yeah, look, I mean, there are different strategies for, I guess if you like disruptive behavior in children, or when children are showing kind of dysregulated emotions as well. And attachment-based interventions will offer certain strategies, but there are some other strategies that can be borrowed from other parent interventions as well, and other models of parent interventions. And so maybe I'll take this opportunity to talk briefly about some alternative models, some alternative strategies. So let's say if one is looking at a behavioural parent training program, the advice and support that a parent would get in the context of that program would be, let's come back to that example you're talking about. Let's say it's the child is in the supermarket, they've gone down the candy aisle, they've seen a piece of candy that they just really, really want, and then they ask the parent if they can have it. The parent says, no, you can't, it's too expensive, we've got too much at home, etc., etc. The child drops to the floor, they have a tantrum. And I'm really a person who's delivering this intervention, a behavioural intervention, would understand the behaviour in terms of the child being defiant, having a temper tantrum, but they would advise to the parent that it's important not to reinforce that behaviour. So if the child drops to the floor, really the last thing you want to do is give them the candy in that moment, because essentially that's going to reinforce their kind of not okay behaviour, if you'd like. And in terms of what is okay and not okay, that varies from parent to parent. Parents have the right to make their own decision about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. But let's say if a parent says that tantrum is not okay, that parent wouldn't be advised to then give the candy to the child, because that would just reinforce that kind of not okay behavior. So what the parent would be recommended to do would be to either ignore the child, okay, to use planned ignoring and to take attention away from the negative behavior, or in some situations maybe to use a method like timeout, where the parent might remove the child from the difficult situation or whatever is reinforcing their negative behavior, and take them to a calmer area to have some time out. Parents can still use time out in the context of a shopping centre. They just have to be prepared to be able to do it. But essentially the next step would be to praise the child, to positively reinforce them for showing the pro-social or the okay behaviour. So as soon as the child is calm, the parent wants to jump on that and say, Dave, I love the way you are calm right now and you're listening to me so well, high five, and to use a lot of verbal praise, for example, as a positive reinforcer. So in terms of behavioural parent interventions, one of the key principles is removing attention away from negative behaviours and putting that attention onto positive behaviours. Because when parents come into intervention programs, essentially they're doing the opposite. They're putting a lot of attention and effort onto the negative behaviours, and that actually becomes reinforcing for the child. And they're so stressed and just exhausted and just over it that they actually don't have time and energy and attention to actually catch the child being good. Okay, and so they often come in sort of stuck in this trap where they're engaging in a lot of conflict and a lot of what we call parent-child coercion happening. And essentially the idea is to help coach the parent on developing non-coercive, more consistent discipline in the context of a positive parent-child relationship. I know that's a long-winded answer sort of to your question, but perhaps I can talk about another alternative as well. The behavioural approach is one strategy to deal with a child who's been quite disruptive. Another alternative would be if you are in a program that is more emotion focused. Okay, so you're doing an emotion-focused parenting intervention. An example of that in a local context might be tuning into kids, which has been developed by Sophie Havikhurst and her colleagues and widely implemented in Australia and other countries too. And essentially here is that parents are really coached to be emotion coaches. And so these types of programs go beneath behavior and they really look at children's underlying emotional needs. And so the idea is that the parent is instructed and coached in able to develop more confidence and competencies in first identifying children's emotions and then labeling children's emotions and validating their emotions. And so the idea is to help parents not dismiss or to sort of just ignore children's emotions, but actually see emotions as an opportunity to connect with the child and to use that as an occasion in which they can actually understand more about the child's emotional needs and to respond to those. So coming back to the sort of the situation with a child in the supermarket aisle, that the child's having a tantrum, someone working from an emotion-focused intervention might actually, in that case, depending on how dysregulated the child is, if they're sort of 10 out of 10 dysregulated, the idea is not to say too much. Okay, so the child's sort of in emotional mind. The idea is just to be there with the child, and you might just through your non-verbal show some empathy and to sort of emotionally contain your child until they're ready to engage. If the child is not 10 out of 10 and they might be sort of 6 out of 10 and you're seeing the child getting frustrated, you might get in early. You might just say, hey, I can see you're really frustrated about this. And often when we just sort of identify and label the emotion, it actually helps the child just be understood and heard and actually can together help us co-regulate that child's difficult emotions. So so really, there's different alternatives in terms of how we can respond to a child. It can be looking at the behavior and really shaping the behavior and helping, reinforce more positive behavior in children. Or we might be working from a framework where we're trying to understand children's emotions to help them become more emotionally competent and to really to accept, to validate, and to appreciate children's emotional experiences to help them become more emotionally intelligent, if you'd like.
Yeah, okay. I can see the value certainly of taking from each of those approaches and almost parenting from a blend where it's most appropriate to each situation.
Yeah, I mean, just on the point about the blend, I mean, each intervention would recommend that the parent will be consistent with what they've been supporting the parent with in terms of the strategies according to that program. But I think in real life, parents are quite sort of eclectic in their parenting strategies, that they will sort of use different things at different times. And I think, I really do appreciate parents' expertise of their own child. Parents know their kids the best. They are, if you'd like, sort of vital historians of the child as well. They know the child's developmental history. They know what triggers their children and so on. And so I think parents do have a lot of wisdom and experience. The ones that do come into our programs are the ones where they just really sort of feel stuck and just don't know what to do next for all different reasons. And so, and it could be related to the temperament of the child and, other kind of stresses that the family is experiencing at that time as well.
So you mentioned something there, which is actually relates to a burning question that I've been having about planned ignoring and timeout and how that relates to attachment needs of a child. So I came across recently, he's a physician, but he writes a lot about parenting and attachment styles. Dr. Gabor Mate, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's big in the self-help kind of world. He says a lot of controversial things. And one of the things he mentioned, which has really got me thinking, is that timeout and planned ignoring, whilst effective in the short term, actually are kind of a manipulation of the attachment needs of the child, in the sense that you're using their need to connect with you against them. And again, I don't necessarily have an opinion on this, but it's radical in the sense that I haven't heard of it before, this kind of way of thinking. So what are your thoughts on that and the the relationship between timeouts and its relationship to manipulating the attachment needs?
Yeah, man. I mean, this is another great question, Indy, and this is sort of it's been drawing a lot of different perspectives, particularly in the last sort of 5, 10 years as well. And the first thing I'd say is that look, everyone has a different perspective on this, and I think everyone is meaning well. I think everyone is trying to think about what is in the best interests of my child or children in our community. Okay, so the first thing I'd say is I totally understand it, and I believe that people genuinely have the best intentions to support kids, and that's great. And often our perspectives are based on different things. They might be based on our own experiences growing up. They might be based on anecdotal observations in a community sense or among your friends or peers, or anecdotal observations if you're a clinician. They also might be based on the literature and what is evidence-based. And so if you want me to answer from the perspective of the literature, what I can tell you is that at the moment, at the time of recording, I can't see any compelling evidence as to timeout being harmful for a child. Okay, and by way of disclosure, I've been trained in behavioural and non-behavioural interventions, and I do a lot of work in the attachment space. And so at the moment, a lot of my work is focused on implementing attachment-based interventions. So I don't want people to think that I'm biased, that I'm just a behaviourist. I definitely don't identify as just being a behaviourist or anything like that. But what I do appreciate is it's really important, particularly in my field of clinical psychology, is that we're looking at what the evidence is telling us. And at the moment, there's not any solid evidence that's saying that timeout is harmful for a child. And the concern that I share with my professional colleagues is that we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater, that some people are just turning away from behavioural parent programs because of the timeout bit. But the irony with the timeout is that actually timeout was introduced in the late sort of 20th century as an alternative to corporal punishment, to things like harsh discipline, to spanking. And so it was coming from a good place. It was actually removing the child from a situation where the parent could even sort of become physically abusive. And so we have done some research on timeout in my research group. I had a student recently. We published a paper on what are parents telling us about timeout, and we even sampled some parents who, I guess, if you like, are kind of timeout haters, or parents who prefer not to use timeout. And sort of they're telling us some really interesting things, that they think it doesn't value connections, so similar to what you're telling me about this other chap in the pop psych space. And they're also telling us things that they think that it's not supported by the evidence. And so it's that last point that's most concerning for me, and that we really need to disseminate what the literature is telling us, is that, again, there's no evidence to suggest that it's harmful to children or to their attachment. And I think there's a similar debate happening in early childhood, in infancy, when it comes to sleep, and to how, what's the best way to settle a child when it comes to them sleeping? Do we, have them co-sleeping with us? Do we rock them all the way until they go to sleep? Or do we use sleep training after the age of 6 months? And again, parents are divided, and professionals are divided as well. But I think the most important thing to do is, when it comes to these debates, is to look at what the research is telling us. And also, it's really important to not be limited by the research, to appreciate people's lived experience and anecdotes. But I think if you're a professional, and if you're disseminating a perspective that's contrary to the evidence base, I personally believe that is unethical, and that's concerning. And so I also believe that parents have the right to choose methods that they want to choose, and they have the right to hear what is backed by the evidence and what's not. So happy to discuss more about this, if you have more kind of specific points that you'd like to unpack. I think it's a really big topic out there at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think the take-home message there from what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is that what Dr. Mate is saying, and to be fair, he actually doesn't cite much research. He makes a lot of assumptions, I think, but is that it's not, we don't see that in the evidence. We don't see that timeout is harmful to the attachment security of a child in the evidence as of now.
Yeah, I will go on record and say, at the time of recording, I have looked into the literature, and I have not been able to find any evidence saying that timeout specifically is harmful to the child's developing attachment. And so, I'm unaware of what Dr. Mate said about this, and I'm aware of some of his other work, and I totally respect his thinking and his work. And I think this conversation is great because what it's doing is actually making us reflect on what we're suggesting to parents and why. And so I think, if anything, it's kind of strengthening existing views as well, and it's developing competing ones. But we're having to reflect on, okay, where are we getting our sources of information from? And in the parenting space, that's a really big issue at the moment, is that there is so much information about parenting. And even personally, as a parent, I need to think about, where am I going to for my information? Together with my wife, where do we get our information from? There's so much stuff out there on the internet and websites and blogs. And the other confusing thing is, you've got people with a doctor title who are telling you different things. And so I don't blame parents. As a parent myself, it's confusing when I look into other areas of child development. It might be physical health, an area that I'm not an expert in, and it's confusing when you see people write different things who seem to be well trained in a certain area. So, but I think, again, I come back down to the principles of making sure that what we are looking into does have an evidence base, but also implementing strategies that are in line with our values as parents. And so, as a clinician, it's a really important part of my work with parents and families is to understand what their values are, what their cultural experiences are, are they religious, what the spirituality is, how were they parented, what would they like to do, with their child. And so my aim is to let them know about what the evidence is telling us, but then to integrate that with their preferences and their values and characteristics, and then to use my expertise to really work with them to develop a plan and an approach to parenting their child in often what is a difficult, stressful situation.
Well, what you're saying is taking me back to foundations, in which you taught me and Dave about the shared decision-making model in terms of evidence-based, but also, values and, doing what's collaborative for the client as well. So, it feels like it's come full circle.
Yep, and Indy, if I hadn't already graded your assessment, I'd give you another sort of 10% right now, but you're right, exactly. And I'm really referring to the evidence-based practice model, about that shared decision-making model.
Well, if we go to parenting for teenagers and adolescents, from an attachment-based parenting model, are there differences between or nuances between how you might parent in that different kind of developmental stage? And if not, how would you apply some of the attachment-based parenting foundations to the unique developmental stage that is kind of teenagehood?
Yeah, I mean, obviously when we're parenting an older child or an adolescent, it's really important to understand, what is a typical developmental need at that stage. And so, older children, adolescents now have a greater need for autonomy and independence. Okay, they don't want to just be stuck with their parent. Most teens don't want to be kind of physically tied to their parent. In fact, they want the opposite. They want to exercise their freedom. They're developing their identity. And so what becomes really important as children grow into the formative years is they start to feel accepted by peers, and they start to develop healthy relationships with friends. And they might, some peers might even sort of explore romantic relationships as well. So, parents sometimes can take that personally. They can sort of, have a really close relationship with their child, and then suddenly they reach a certain point and the child doesn't want them to kiss them at the school drop-off point, or as they get older, that the child doesn't want the parent to be around, and so on. And so it can be difficult for parents. It's like, oh gosh, we had this really kind of tight thing happening, and now I have to give you space. And so as parents, we need to sort of learn to step back and to really to celebrate this developmental milestone, just like I'm celebrating my little daughter and her having separation anxiety, that wanting autonomy and more independence is something to be celebrated. It's part of healthy development. And so, from an attachment point of view, we talk about, in the context of the Connect Parent program that was developed by Marlene Moretti in Canada, we talk about, with one particular metaphor we use, is the attachment coin. that there's two sides to the coin, that there's the attachment need of connection on one side, and then on the other side, there's the need for independence. And you can't have one without the other. So with an adolescent, in order for them to feel independent, they need to feel connected. Okay, and that comes back to the idea of having a secure base from which they can explore from. If you don't have that secure base, you don't feel as comfortable and safe to explore. You don't feel as comfortable to be independent. But you also need, you also need to have some independence to feel connected. For instance, you have to have your own space in order to be able to have, that desire to want to feel connected as well. Because too much connection can be a bad thing as well. If say, for instance, a child is very clingy and it can be stressful for the caregiver and so on. So I think when it comes to parenting and adolescents, it's important to understand, what are those developmental needs? And it's also, you're sort of entering this period where, we know neurobiologically that adolescents' brains are still developing, okay? They haven't developed, for instance, completely their frontal lobes, so sometimes their decisions are a bit off. To say it in like a nice way, that they might engage in more risk-taking behaviours, and I'm sure we can all reflect on our adolescence years and the silly decisions we made. And so sometimes parents need to let adolescents sort of learn from logical consequences. And what I mean by this is that, well, if you rock up continually late to high school, you're going to get in trouble. And so I can't always physically get you there on time, but I can step back and guide you through the process of dealing with the logical consequences. So if I rock up continually late, a logical consequence might be I get a detention or whatever the kind of disciplinary thing might be in their high school. And so that's an example of a logical consequence. And so parents, sometimes need to use these logical consequences because, for instance, they can't physically pick up a 15-year-old and put them into timeout anymore. But it's really important for parents to take time out from their teen as well, particularly if they're engaging in a lot of conflict. And that just gives the parent an opportunity to regulate their own anger and frustration so they can re-engage with their teen. And we do talk a lot about conflict in the context of the Connect program, that attachment program I was telling you about. And we really see conflict as not something that should be avoided necessarily, but something that parents should be aware of as really an opportunity for growth. Because, when we're having conflict in a relationship, it's telling us that there's something not quite right. And often it helps us understand where that not quite right thing might be. Okay. And it can actually, if we sensitively respond to conflict and if we're emotionally engaged in conflict, not being kind of overly hostile, not being disengaged, but being in the middle somewhere, we actually might be able to learn from conflict and actually grow through conflict. And part of secure attachment is not the absence of conflict. It's really the presence of repair when those ruptures do happen. Okay. And so, of course, naturally, as a child goes into the adolescence years, we do see in some parent-child relationships an increase in conflict because often the adolescent is just bidding for more autonomy. They want more independence. They want to develop their own identity. We don't want to be told what to do by our parent who's boring and doesn't understand our generation. Okay. So the teen wants space, and often the conflict is about that. It's like, hey, parent, this is in my personal domain. You don't get to tell me how I do my hair, how many nose rings I have, all that kind of stuff. This is my own personal domain. I want autonomy and agency. And so often the conflict, can be precipitated by that natural developmental need. So again, if the parent understands those sort of attachment needs for connection, but also independence, and if they can stay emotionally engaged and calm during conflict, we can actually use conflict as an opportunity for growth. I think there's a lot more I could say about that, but I want to hand it back over to you, Indy, because I feel like I've been talking a lot, and I'll be curious to hear your questions too.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, a lot of what you're saying makes sense, and it feels like such a delicate balance between allowing independence, autonomy, allowing them to learn from their mistakes, because that's a part of life, and taking responsibility for your life, but also I imagine stepping in where and when required. I imagine I can reflect back on some of the things that I did, and if my parents didn't, step in on certain and extreme situations, then the consequences would have been disastrous. So yeah, I imagine it's such a delicate balance, and especially being a change from earlier childhood where the parent is a lot more hands-on, trying to kind of become accustomed to that change in roles as a parent.
And it's really like in the Connect program, it's, what we tell parents of these adolescents is we're not saying that anything goes. It's not saying step back and just let your teen walk all over you. And so, you make a really good point. It's important to still have those consistent, firm limits. But at the same time, it's really important to step back from those strong reactions, okay, and from those strong thoughts and feelings we might be having toward our child, and to really step into our children's experience and to really become more curious about, what is it about their behavior that is telling me something about their deeper attachment needs, and how can I respond to those deeper needs as opposed to react to kind of the negative behaviors, the kind of annoying, frustrating behaviors that I'm seeing. And so often when parents come into this Connect program, which is run with groups, that a lot of parents are just fatigued, they're exhausted, they're overwhelmed, they're stuck in battles, and they've just kind of gone on autopilot with their kids, where they're just going bang, 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 and escalating conflict and aggression. And so, really in the Connect program, we're trying to encourage parents to look at behavior from an attachment perspective.
Hello, everyone. Just a super quick break from today's episode to let you know that if you are enjoying today's deep dive into attachment-based parenting with Dr. Dave Pasalich, then you may very well enjoy my deep dive into attachment styles from an adult relationship perspective with Dr. Jesse Stern. So in this episode, we discussed all things attachment styles and how they play out in your romantic relationships and how you can increase your own attachment security as an adult. If you'd like to listen to that episode, you can check it out below in the show notes. Thanks, and now back to today's deep dive with Dr. Dave Pasalich. There's one other, it's a big question, okay? It's a societal, philosophical question, if you like, but I think it's an important one. And I'm wondering if attachment security is something that in an ideal world we are striving for and wanting for with our children. Do you think that societal pressures, like for example in Australia, cost of living is going up, right, and it puts more and more pressure on parents, in many cases, to be able to support the needs of their family unit? But do you think there are broader kind of societal influences that, if rectified, would help the outcome of greater attachment security on a broader scale, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, again, I think this is a really interesting question. It's getting me to reflect more deeply on this topic. And actually, what comes to mind when you're talking about costs in society, there's actually a recent study looking at the financial costs of insecure attachment. And not just disruptive behavior or conduct problems. And so insecure attachments are actually costly to services to the community financially, but also socially. But I think really to answer your question, that you're really getting into an important piece in the literature as well, is that we've been speaking a lot about the parent-child relationship, almost as if it exists in like a vacuum. But really the reality is that things are far more complex. And so the first point I'll make on this is that families at the moment are struggling in a very unique way. As you said, there's high costs of living, and if people have just bought a house, there's mortgage repayments that are just going through the roof. And I mean, these are all very understandable stresses that a lot of families are experiencing. And we also know that these stresses can spill over into relationships within the family, into that marital relationship, into the parent-child relationship. And so if you add more stress to a sort of a relationship, it might be more difficult for, say, a caregiver to be as responsive to their child and to have the capacity to be sensitive and to take the time out and so on. And so, I guess the things that you are talking about on a societal level are what we would say in psychological research, the really additional risk factors or the psychosocial risk factors. Okay, so that they're coming from a broader influence, and so, but nonetheless, yeah, they can create more stress in a parent-child relationship, and so I think whenever there's any additional stresses added to a family and to a community, and I think even internationally, what's going on at the moment, say in the Ukraine, and just the trauma and the terror that these families and these communities are experiencing, which I cannot even comprehend. But the amount of stress that is being placed on these families, who are actually, a lot of them are separated too, that of course that's going to be changing, at least in this season, the way that parents are parenting in all different directions. And so, yeah, I think at the end of the day that things are more complicated than just some of these sort of straightforward theories. And so it's really important to, from a clinician's perspective, to really work with that parent in front of me to understand their life, their goals, their desires, their values, but also understand their social milieu or the environment that's surrounding them. I do want to make one more point about society, that, we have been talking about attachment as sort of this sort of exclusive parent-child dyadic or partnership behavior. But that is from quite a sort of European or Western worldview. And so there are, we need to appreciate that from, non-European or non-Western worldviews, say with, in Aboriginal communities, that attachment is much broader than just that parent-child relationship, and so that often in, say, collectivistic cultures, that there are more than just, one or two caregivers raising the child, that raising the child is not just exclusive to the birth parent, for instance. You've got relatives, aunts, uncles, other members of the kinship network helping raise children. And so what I really love about these cultures in particular is that everyone has a part to play, and they feel responsible for that child's well-being, development, and mental health. And so I think at a time like now, when there's so much pressure happening on societal level, I think we really need to play a greater part in supporting not just our own kids, but other people's kids as well. Okay. And obviously, within your sort of immediate social network, how can I be a role model to other children? How can I be a better teacher, if I'm in the educational space? And just, by way of disclosure, something I've done over the, greater than a decade now, is that I've been a mentor on the weekends to kids who have been in out-of-home care. A lot of them have been in foster care, kinship care. And that's one way, one little way I've tried to contribute to bringing up other people's kids and to be a positive role model, and to even try and promote some secure attachment in these kids where they might be exposed to a lot of adversities and trauma. So, yeah, I think it's a really important question you're asking, Indy. I don't know if I answered it in the way you would have liked, but those are my thoughts nonetheless on I guess, the broader question about society, where we're heading, the stresses, and so on.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly opened my eyes. Very interesting points. So thank you for sharing that. Just finally, do you have any final parts of or bits of advice that you wanted to impart upon parents or parents to be listening?
Parents to be excited. Parenting is a beautiful thing. It is a stressful transition. So you want to get physically, but also emotionally and spiritually prepared for the journey of parenting. I also want to say too, we've been discussing about sort of different approaches to interventions, different approaches to parenting. I just want to reiterate that there's not one right or wrong way. Okay. So, really as parents, we need to take the liberty to make our own informed decisions about how we want to parent our own child. And that might be in line with bigger influences that are coming from our, culture, our worldviews, our religion, and so on. But when I say well-informed, it's also useful to look at the evidence base as well. So just probably a heads up, just to have a look at where you're getting your information from. There's so much stuff out there in blogs and social media, and everyone wants to say something now. And so just be careful that, just have a bit of a check where you're getting your information from, and just make sure you trust that source. And I think just really back yourself, be willing to make mistakes. We're not going to get it right as a parent. My students often joke and say to me, do you feel like you're going to be a really great, perfect parent? And I'm like, Mate, I'm going to stuff up just like I already have, just like any other parent. I make mistakes, but I try and learn from them, and I try and do the best I can within within the circumstances I can. And I'm really grateful that I've got a really supportive, beautiful wife. So just a shout out to my wife. She probably won't even listen to this anyway. She doesn't like to listen to me blabber on about kind of evidence-based parenting stuff, but I think that's another thing as well, just to make sure you've got the right support around you, whether it be your partner or family. We don't do this alone. No one wants to parent alone. We need support. We really do. And kids benefit from it as well.
Yeah. No, thank you, Dave. Thanks for sharing all that. I'm not a parent yet, but I certainly will be reviewing our discussion purely from the point of view of learning and taking away all the valuable nuggets that you've shared. So yeah, thank you for opening my eyes, and I'm sure for a lot of people opening their eyes. Yeah, it's been great to chat with you.
Yeah, thank you, Indy. Thanks so much.
And that was Attachment-Based Parenting with Dr. Dave Pasalich. I really enjoyed that one, not just because of my pre-existing relationship with Dave, but also because there's a lot that I learned, not from a parent perspective, because I'm not yet a parent, but more from a clinician perspective. And I think in particular, Dave's wisdom on the coercive kind of child-parent trap was really valuable, and a reminder on how we can focus on the negative things in children, on the dysregulated or disruptive behaviors, and that can actually create and fuel more conflict if we're just focusing on that and forgetting some of the positive and adaptive behaviors that they are actually implementing every day. So that's certainly going to inform my own clinical practice moving forward. And I hope there's a lot that you guys took away from today's episode. I'd love to hear from you and what your key takeaways were and what you learned. So feel free to comment below with any of your key takeaways from today. Next week, we'll be hearing from Professor Bassam Khoury on all things mindfulness-based interventions. And that'll be dropping next Wednesday evening, Australia time. Thanks so much for tuning in. And if you liked today's episode, please give us a like or a subscribe. And I will catch you all next Wednesday.